Good evening, everybody. It's lovely to see all of you here, and welcome to our third annual LEAP lecture, which forms part of the centenary lecture of our 100-year celebration. And to introduce to you our speaker for this evening, Professor Anthony Hopkins. This evening, we have asked him to do the nearly impossible job of summarizing concisely the main lessons he has learned, trends he has observed, and the most important contribution he has witnessed in African economic history over the course of his long career. Professor Hopkins completed a PhD on the economic history of Lagos in 1964, which has formed part of the foundation of the exceptional work he has done on the economic history of Africa. His interest has expanded to many other parts of the globe, including that of America. He recently finished his very big book on the American Empire. This is shortly after a 10-year period at the Walter Prescott Webb Chair of History at the University of Texas, where he won the University Eye of Texas Teaching Award and the College of Liberal Arts Student Council Teaching Award as well. He has mastered a career in the field of economic history, for which he has received various prizes and awards, including honorary doctorate from the University of Stirling in 1996 and University of Birmingham in 2013. Of the very many accolades that he has received, I imagine that one of the more rewarding ones is a book of an essay presented to him in 2011 by former colleagues and students entitled Africa, Empire, and Globalization, Essays in Honor of Tony Hopkins. It serves as great testament to the way the work he has done has resulted in tremendous body of knowledge, but has also helped shape the work of many of his students and colleagues in a unique and indelible way. His recent influence has been on me and some of my colleagues, with some poetry by Alexander Pope that he delightfully finds reflections of his own career and life as an economic historian. So he has agreed that I am allowed to read the poem, so I'll get straight forward to it. Fired at first sight, with what the muse imparts, in fear youth we attempt the heights of art, while from the bounded level of our mind, short views we take, nor see the length behind, but more advanced, behold with strange surprise, new distant scenes of endless science rise. So pleased at first the towering Alps we try, mount over the valves and seem to tread the sky. The eternal snows appear already past, and the first cloud and mountain seems the last. But those attained we tremble to survey, the growing labors of the lengthened way. The increasing prospect tires our wandering eyes. Hills peep over hills, and Alps on Alps arise. So with no further ado, I would like to welcome our honorary professor, Prof Hopkins. Thank you.
So what I have to do today is to begin by thanking Anton, the Department of History, for welcoming me here, making an office available, and spending precious time on the hospitality they have kindly given me. And particularly to Johan Fourie for his exceptional work in mining email correspondence and keeping everything afloat over many months, again, in order to bring me here in association with Ian Phimister of Bloemfontein, where I will be going for next week. Without their initiative, financial as well as moral, I would not be present, and I would have missed not only beautiful Stellenbosch in the spring, but the chance to meet such wonderful students and inspiring work that they're doing, as I have been able to meet so far. I can only say these things because I know this audience is as intelligent as it is handsome, and also immune completely from flattery. Now, it's impossible to follow that generous introduction, except to say that the only problem with listening to such words which are music in my ears is that, of course, they raise expectations. However, in the course of a very long career, I can say that I have become, putting modesty aside, a master of the anticlimax. So this has the great merit that immediately you can settle down to know that the level will be low, but at the same time of a uniform kind. There'll be nothing uncertain, and if it wasn't for this microphone, I would mumble in the traditional academic way, and you'd be quite unable to hear me. Now, what I have is I've got a text in front of me to keep to time, which is not my usual way of presenting, but I will try to make it look as if the text is not dominating me or you too much. As Borel said, what I'm going to try to do is to, in a very compressed and superficial way, look at the way in which economic history of Africa, variously conceived, has evolved over, I'm afraid to say, 50 years. And I'm doing this from the perspective of tropical Africa, that big bit that's even north of Zimbabwe. I believe that what I have to say will also fit with South Africa, albeit with a different context and particularities, and with a different chronology. And I'd be very interested to know what you make of what I'm saying in the context that you are so familiar with. I'm particularly aiming what I have to say at the new generation of researchers who may not be aware of historiographical oscillations, or may assume even that knowledge of them has no direct relevance to current priorities. Each phase has brought vigor and illumination, but it has also been tempted into making claims that exceed the capacity of the chosen theory and the requirements of evidence. As anomalies and limits appear, defects erode confidence. Alternatives are then either imported or re-emerge from a forgotten historical past. An awareness of historiography, then, provides an unsurpassed test of claims to superiority and originality, and in this way creates space for young scholars to express their individuality within and beyond the current paradigm. This is not to assert that the phases I'm identifying have had a monopoly of academic enterprise. Distinctive contributions have been made, of course, by numerous other groups and individuals throughout this period. African historians of Africa have themselves made notable contributions to the task of decolonizing the past. Nevertheless, it's fair to say that successive generations of new researchers have been exposed to at least one of the phases that I'm about to identify at a formative moment of their careers, and that its influence has left a permanent mark on their approach to the subject. With this qualification in place, I will sketch the 5 main schools of thought that have influenced the subject in my own observation, and conclude with some very provisional comments on the current phase of what I'm calling the new economic history of Africa. Given that these schools arose typically in opposition to one another, it would be reasonable to suppose that they had little in common. Yet they shared important features that need to be identified if they are to be understood. Each phase was characterized by a form of academic tribalism. Group identity and solidarity was built on an approved language that separated insiders from outsiders. Special terms constituted passwords that had to be learned and recited to authenticate membership. Self-referencing predominated. Other schools of thought were ignored or referred to in stereotyped fashion. Publications clustered in favored outlets. Novelty was claimed where modesty was required. The literature was characterized by a relentless certainty of purpose. It was devoid of self-irony, which was incompatible with a belief in the superiority of the program and reverence for the theory that underpinned it. These qualities served a fundamental purpose, that of holding the tribe together. The main trends in development studies have all been produced in the West, mainly in the United States, Britain, and France, and applied to Africa to a degree that distinguishes the continent from other parts of the former colonial empires. Moreover, lack of local funding and restricted opportunities at home have prompted many young African researchers to take training and employment in the West. The results of this rite of passage have not reduced the quality of research, but arguably they have limited the diversity that independent African viewpoints would otherwise have supplied. This bias has both expressed and reinforced the special place that Africa has occupied in the imagination of the West. From the time Shakespeare spoke of Africa and golden joys to the less melodic language of development studies today. No other continent has been assigned quite the same role. Africa is seen often unself-consciously as the laboratory and touchstone of the West. In moods of confidence, political or academic, it is a place where brilliant new ideas can be applied and their efficacy demonstrated. In moods of self-doubt, Africa serves as the custodian of eternal verities that the West has allowed to lapse. The sense of an archaic or pristine Africa has not only survived contrary evidence, but also draws plausibility from modern research. The very antiquity of the continent, the home of man, and as even old liberals would add, woman, provide the starting point of the world. The manifold problems of today dramatize the gap between the prehistoric past and the present and tempt the West to offer or impose solutions. Africa then becomes the supreme test of the West's intellectual and technological capabilities. If the continent's problems can be solved, no other challenge can defy Western skills and know-how. The danger, which is evident but often passes unnoticed, lies in the projection of a form of neo-colonial scholasticism. Experts who desire to liberate Africa, whether from alien rule or from poverty, find themselves colonizing the continent with ideas that were originally devised elsewhere and in other circumstances. The temptation which successive waves of experts have found irresistible is to fit Africa into the paradigm of the day. Social scientists aspire to the methodology and supposed objectivity of the natural sciences. The record shows that where Africa is concerned, they have also been modern missionaries, inspired by a belief in the power of secular theories to unlock the secrets of economic backwardness. The rise and fall of scholarly priorities can be explained by a combination of external and internal influences. Down to the 1990s, regional interests tended to accompany the independence movements. The initial scholarly focus on West Africa, the first part of sub-Saharan Africa to gain independence, gave way to other parts of the continent as East, Central, and finally South Africa followed suit in successive decades. International considerations, notably the Cold War, ran parallel to these shifts and sometimes reinforced them as funding, scholarly as well as military, joined the battle for hearts and minds. With the fall of the Soviet Empire, commitments generated by the Cold War weakened. With the end of apartheid, the last of the decolonizing movements reached fulfillment. Foreign involvement in Africa remains important, of course, and in the case of China, as we know, is expanding rapidly. At present, however, academic interests focus mainly on the performance of Africa's independent states, their capacity for development, and their record in achieving it. During the 1950s and 60s, the single most important internal influence on the emerging field of development studies was modernization theory. Today, it is hard for younger scholars to comprehend either the substance or the influence of this body of thought, which embraced nearly all the social sciences. Modernization theory assumed that there was a sharp contrast between traditional and modern societies. Theorists held that underdeveloped societies need to be thoroughly transformed if they were to shed attributes that were antithetical to development. These profoundly simple propositions, enveloped in erudite language, bolstered by impressive references, and sporting a good deal of formidable quantification, were as influential in their day, if not more so, as dependency theory, Marxism, and postmodernism were to become in subsequent decades. History had no part to play in this enterprise. Indeed, one of the enviable advantages of the theory was the ability to produce rapid results for policymakers without first needing to engage in tedious research into the past. As the findings of modernization theory began to make their way into policy recommendations, however, their credibility was challenged by influences that were to change the nature of the debate. The terminal agony of the United States in Vietnam at the close of the 1960s dented belief in the Western mission, as well as in those charged with executing it. The economic crisis triggered by the rise in petroleum prices in 1973 led to a loss of confidence in Western economies and in their accompanying nostrums. The early results of research into indigenous history cast doubt on the categorization of pre-colonial Africa as a traditional society. Modernization theory, which had been floated on a raft of post-war confidence, sank suddenly and swiftly. The names of its once famous advocates have long since been deleted from student reading lists. The way was open for an alternative view that captured the new mood of a skeptical generation. It was in these circumstances that the dependency thesis, which was already familiar to specialists on Latin America, was launched on its wider mission, the colonization of the intellectual world. André Gunder Frank, its prolific popularizer, attained guru status in the 1970s. A new generation of students in the West found the set of beliefs they had been searching for. Murky waters miraculously cleared. Capitalism was not the solution, it was the problem. With one spectacular somersault, commentators could achieve a view of the world that was just as simple and as encompassing as modernization theory, but that, being its antonym, led in an entirely different direction. Poverty was not an original condition, it was a historical creation. In penetrating the world, European capitalism had created underdevelopment, first by drawing other societies into networks of dependence, and then by exploiting them through the mechanism of unequal exchange. Policy recommendations flowed readily. Since foreign capitalism had created underdevelopment, ties with the West should be minimized and, if possible, severed. Future prosperity would flow from creating independence, which meant ideally aiming for a state of self-sufficiency. The dependency thesis became the single most important new influence on the study of the underdeveloped world in the decade following the demise of modernization theory. In contrast to the previous conventional wisdom, the dependency thesis placed history at the center of its analysis. Social scientists who had ignored history or had treated it as a lower branch of learning rushed to recant and convert. Newcomers eagerly accepted the new doctrine. The result gave an immediate boost to the study of economic history of the non-industrial world, which became one of the fastest growing branches of African studies in the 1970s. Seen from the vantage point of today, the chief legacy of the dependency thesis was that it liberated scholars to ask questions that had previously been kept off the agenda. Walter Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, published in 1972, was the most popular example of the thesis applied to Africa. And the argument contained in its title was immensely influential. Its long-term effect, however, was historiographical rather than substantive. By emphasizing the exploitative consequences of capitalist exchange relations, Rodney made it acceptable to criticize African as well as European rulers and entrepreneurs, including slave traders. By stressing the deleterious influence of European connections, the dependency thesis also opened the way to a reconsideration of colonial history, which had lost favor in the immediate aftermath of political independence in the 1960s. These revisions were supportive of radical nationalism and accompanying experiments with African socialism. They also dealt a blow to the first generation of bourgeois nationalist historians whose heroes, the great leaders of the past, were suddenly transformed into accomplices and sometimes villains. In principle, this was a welcome and overdue development. Nevertheless, the application of the dependency thesis to Africa was attended by significant drawbacks, though these were not apparent to disciples at the time. Despite the use of radical language, the weight attached to external trade reinforced an orthodox research tradition, whereas the real challenge lay in moving further into the interior of the continent and gathering material on production. More important still, the emphasis on external influences obliged adherents to adopt the position that indigenous societies had only a limited ability to shape their own history. This view had its merits, but it also severely curtailed the scope of the dependency thesis and obliged practitioners to present indigenous people as victims rather than agents. The application of simple verificatory procedures encouraged converts to suspend disbelief in finding what they were looking for. Evident tautologies and simplicities were overlooked. Selective perception operated because the need for a new and comprehensive theory of a complex world was irresistible. A large proportion of the work undertaken under the influence of the dependency thesis, like modernization theory, has now sunk without trace. As the limits of the dependency thesis became clear, it was overtaken and absorbed by a more thoroughgoing radicalism derived from Marx. From the mid-70s to the disintegration of the Soviet Empire at the close of the 80s, Marxist influences provided a new source of inspiration for students of African history. The emphasis on economic forces was retained but relocated. The focus on the sphere of exchange was replaced by a new emphasis on production, which overcame the external bias of the dependency thesis and allowed Africans to play a central part in shaping the history of their continent. The chief aim of the new work was to identify indigenous and introduced modes of production, which would then serve as engines in Africa's past. Once these had been found, their internal contradictions could be followed by tracing the antagonism between emerging social classes. This line of inquiry extended the new history from below that had found influential expression in studies of class formation in Europe and of slavery in the United States. The search for contradictions and conflict inspired pioneering research on the institution of slavery in Africa and also opened the way for the study of exploited females. A new set of gurus, headed by French intellectuals, came to prominence and began to fill Anglo-Saxon ears and minds. A novel terminology more complex than modernization theory and more sophisticated than the language of dependency came into use. A new generation of research students labored in the archives to establish the antiquity of class conflict by identifying modes of production and the consequent relations of production they generated. As the enterprise proceeded, there was a tendency for researchers to emerge with a mode of production that reflected the particularities of the case. Long-distance modes of production joined slave modes and jostled with cattle modes. African farmers became peasants to enable them to enter a preconceived schema of historical development. As examples multiplied, so theological disputes broke out about what Marx really meant or would have said had he been commenting in the 1970s on pre-colonial and colonial Africa. Texts became denser and language more convoluted as authors struggled to reconcile the circle of theory with the square of Africa. At the same time, the search for classes in the distant past ran into predictable difficulties that could be handled only by concentrating on exceptional cases or by retreating from the pre-colonial period, studying 20th century developments, and by acknowledging even there the embryonic state of class relations in tropical Africa. Modes became mirages. Class conflict offered limited insight into long-term movements within African societies. The motor in the African past had still to be found. By the early 1980s, there were clear signs of a retreat from the high ground of Marxist theory. A halt was called to the modes of production debate. The central theme of exploitation, which had been stressed not only with respect to international trade, but also to relations within the household, was softened by a recognition that Marx had also emphasized the progressive elements in capitalism. It was now allowed that capitalism had raised the level of productive forces in Africa. At this point, however, Marxist scholars found themselves in an impasse. The preferred economic models fitted awkwardly, where they fitted at all. The state remained a superstructure, despite attempts to endow it with semi-autonomy. Culture remained an epiphenomenon. As Marxism passed its peak, greater attention was paid to the Annales school, which had begun to make its mark on the Anglo-Saxon world in the 1970s, aided, like Marxism, by a clutch of translations. The new approach appealed because it attached weight to capitalist forces and to the long-run evolution of social structures without being tied to a class-based analysis. It also offered a practical research program for historians who had either resisted the ruminations of Marxist high theory or had wearied of it. Emerging economic problems in Africa centered on drought and migration stimulated an interest in the history of demography, climate, and disease, which Annales had long regarded as being central to the study of history. These influences also helped promote women from their role as minor characters in the great story of heroic male achievements. The Annalists were no more committed to feminist ideals than their Anglo-Saxon counterparts or their Marxist predecessors. But the notion of an histoire totale included women and children by definition, and so provided an appropriate receptacle for the heightened interest in gender that was being propelled by the women's liberation movement in the United States. Unlike previous schools of thought, the Annalistes were concerned to understand the world rather than to change it. Histoire totale spoke about the oppressed, among others, but not specifically for them. This purpose diluted the ideological content of research, but limited its immediate political appeal. Consequently, when Marxism hit the Berlin Wall in 1989, the resulting void was political as well as academic. The work of the Annales School was not so much abandoned, but absorbed. Two of its central concerns, the environment and gender, feature prominently in current research priorities, even though they have been much enlarged by subsequent influences. And its interest in mentalité fed into the next phase, postmodernism. The appeal of postmodernism expanded rapidly during the 1990s and opening years of the present century, when the flow of studies representing the new genre reached levels attained at their peak by modernization theory, the dependency thesis, and Marxism. Postmodernism upheld radical approaches to global issues in the face of conservative triumphalism. As the economic base appeared to crumble, the superstructure assumed a new importance. By inverting orthodoxy, moral hegemony, validated by Antonio Gramsci, became the key in understanding power and inequality. Cultural history assumed an unprecedented degree of eminence. Studies of representations of material forms, from buildings to bodies, came to the fore. Texts were, in the phrase, interrogated to reveal how pejorative images reinforced negative stereotypes of non-Western societies. Innumerable studies disinterred the prejudices of 19th century novelists. Conrad's Heart of Darkness was permanently illuminated many times. Postmodernism undoubtedly gave cultural history a welcome boost. However, unlike its predecessors, postmodernism made no contribution to economic history. Its focus on textual images, its skepticism about the concept of reality, and its limited interest in causality provided methodological grounds for avoiding some of the central preoccupations of historical inquiry. Hostility to what were called totalism and essentialism, which were regarded as Western impositions on the rest of the world, inhibited the study of long-run economic and political change. In bypassing the problem of poverty, postmodernism removed it from the view of a generation of young researchers. Finally, though this was not necessarily a defect, postmodernists had no practical program for the real world, whose tangibility they in any case doubted. Postmodernism in turn retreated in the early years of the present century. By then, the study of misleading representations of the other had become subject to diminishing returns. The message had been delivered. though few advocates appreciated that much that was new to them had already been identified in the first big push of African studies in the 1960s. More importantly, changes in the external world jolted its underlying assumptions. The dramatic destruction of the Twin Towers in 2001 was a material fact as well as a symbolic one. The global financial crisis that began in 2008 brought the role of economic forces to the forefront of commentary and research on influences shaping the world order. It became necessary and once again acceptable to take a pragmatic view of reality, to provide material forces with structures, and to place them in a global setting. This enterprise made room for a historical perspective and favored the resurgence of economic history in particular. So I now turn, I will say in conclusion, but as you know, some conclusions can take a while, to my final commentary, which is on the new economic history of Africa. At the turn of the present century, a new generation of economists entered Africa and engaged with its past. This was an unexpected development because most economists in the United States and Britain had parted company with history. Economics became increasingly mathematical, longer perspectives were put aside. Yet in contrast to many countries in Asia, Africa's apparent inability to climb the development ladder presented a set of intriguing analytical problems that strengthened the presumption that there was something distinctive about the continent's predicament. The conundrum attracted the attention of a group of economists who applied econometric techniques to test propositions derived from what had become known as the new institutional economics. Practitioners in this branch of economics assigned priority to institutions which were defined with increasing generosity to include political and cultural values as well as economic variables. Some researchers also chose subjects that required a historical context. As a result, current obstacles to development are again being evaluated as legacies from the past. African exceptionalism has become a testing ground for the universal assumptions of the institutionalist wing of economic theory. The outcome of this exercise will not be examined in any detail here, partly because the endeavor is still underway, and partly because assessments of the state of the art are readily available in print. Essentially, however, it can be said that the first wave of economists was mainly interested in applying cross-country regression analysis to various databases and proxies from which points of departure could be measured and different countries compared. The results indicated that after about 1850, Africa had suffered a reversal of fortune caused primarily by institutional defects, which in turn were created or reinforced by malign influences such as the overseas slave trade and then, in varying degrees, types of colonial rule. The latest work has moved away from grand or grandiose claims and has concentrated on formulating precise hypotheses, often drawn from microeconomic principles. Where relevant too, it has made use of instrumental variables which provide a means of determining causality where the problem requiring explanation is correlated with other variables. This research has been greatly assisted by advances in computing power, which allow time series and demographic data to be assembled with much greater speed and accuracy than was possible in the days when index cards were the standard research tool. It has also shown an impressive respect for documentary evidence. The results of both phases of this research have appeared in the leading journals of economics and perhaps rather less frequently in their historical counterparts, and have become recognized as notable additions to the discipline. Taken as a whole, the new economic history, like previous historiographical phases, has produced some admirable work that has either revealed new dimensions of the past or improved on previous findings. It has had the additional merit of joining studies of Africa to similar work undertaken on other parts of the world, and also joining some parts of Africa to other parts of Africa. Since historians habitually wrestle with problems of causation that involve several contending variables, techniques that offer greater insight and precision should be welcome. Nevertheless, the new claims to historical insight need to pass two basic texts. One derives from the precept known by its familiar acronym GIGO, which states that sound results cannot be extracted from flawed assumptions and poor data. The other is a methodological test that historians take for granted. The relevant variables need to be monitored over time because they are part of a historical process that invariably alters their relative importance. Arguably, the most successful studies are those that have matched a precise research design to robust evidence. The colonial period has provided the most promising starting point because it offers the best chance of assembling long-run data sets. A few examples drawn from a rapidly expanding list of possibilities must suffice. One careful study has related the physical height of a sample of colonial subjects to changes in nutrition and welfare. Another has constructed a time series of urban real wages. Taken together, they offer fresh information about an old question, the course of the standard of living under colonial rule. A few bold explorers have succeeded in extending research into the pre-colonial era. Analysis of probate records has shown that the standard of living of Dutch settlers at the Cape in the 18th century was much higher than had been thought. I'm sure none of you know about that. Another detailed inquiry has concluded that food exports made very little contribution to economic growth in West Africa during the period of the slave trade. A third piece of research, also relating to a region in West Africa, has compiled data on heights and related them to economic welfare during the first half of the 19th century. Several long-run studies, such as those dealing with population and external trade, also show considerable promise because they too relate defined problems to reasonably solid historical evidence. Difficulties arise when over-ambitious projects are matched to inadequate evidence. The reversal of fortune thesis, stimulating though it has been, is vulnerable to this criticism. It is not at all certain from the evidence presented that there was a fortune to be reversed in 1500. Moreover, the account of its assumed decline relies on overgeneralized and often misleading statements respecting quasi-colonial and colonial influences, some of which resurrect familiar and contested historical claims. Reliance on the catch-all notion of path dependence to join the distant past to the present compounds the problem. In compressing the past, large leaps of faith across the centuries produce a species of determinism that dispenses with intervening influences that modify outcomes. Studies that attempt to link themes such as democracy, centralization, war, and trust in pre-colonial Africa to the predicaments of today are equally exposed because the operative terms are capacious and the evidence correspondingly resistant to accurate measurement. Most of the new history is descriptive in the sense of being without normative intent. Some ambitious studies, however, carry policy recommendations, though these are not always made explicit. This feature of the literature needs closer inspection than is possible here, given that its original inspiration was to contribute to ways of illuminating poverty. If, for example, it is true to say that societies organized around segmentary lineages are more inclined to engage in conflict and to have lower levels of trust in non-relatives than are other types of social structure, the implied conclusion is that public policy ought to consider ways of reducing their importance in polities where they are prominent. At this point, however, it is surely wise to pause. Can we be certain of the strength of the causal relationship, given the elasticity of the concept of trust and the diversity of societies labeled segmentary lineages? Can we be sure, too, that the Afrobarometer survey and the World Values Survey, which provide much of the evidential basis, can be relied upon to record and then aggregate perceptions of values accurately? The framing of questions on this subject can conceal an ethnocentric bias, which in effect measures other societies against Western norms without taking account of preferences that arise in different circumstances. People may place a high value on trust in the abstract, but opt to limit its application for compelling reasons that may not be reflected in cross-country analysis and may also change with the passage of time. In the same way, they may value democracy, but prefer authoritarianism in conditions where law and order are overwhelming priorities. If preferences are taken as measures of value, we may end by describing a world that consists of a set of antonyms based on distinctions between traditional and modern societies. Put another way, we may find that modernization theory is not dead, but just resting between engagements. The value of historiography is that it places current scholarly priorities in the context shaped by previous studies of the same general subject. The questions it prompts apply to the present as well as to the past, though of course the answers may be different. An awareness of the failings of previous attempts to understand Africa's history and development problems may save practitioners of today from errors perpetrated by previous schools of thought. As I have suggested, some versions of the new history have not been immune from the temptations that have drawn previous generations of scholars to Africa. Nevertheless, this research has undoubtedly given renewed impetus to a subject that had lost momentum. Moreover, current work illuminates our understanding of long-run development problems in ways that other historians can recognize, respect, and incorporate into their own thinking. It does so at least partly because the practitioners are either Africans or Africanists with a commitment to and feel for the past. Non-economists should not be frightened of numbers, but if they are, they can take heart. Perhaps the most important lesson to have emerged from half a century of scholarly endeavor is that the history of economic development requires multiple approaches and different skills if it is to be fully understood. The greatest difficulty I faced half a century ago was the lack of research on agriculture and pastoralism in the pre-colonial period. Arguably, this is still the toughest challenge facing the current generation of economic historians. Assaulting this problem will require many hands and a variety of skills. When I began, I was told that the economic history of Africa could not be written. We have not yet achieved the impossible, but the expertise and enthusiasm now being shown suggests that in future, even this mountain may be climbed. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. That was really inspiring. One of my favorite economists, Albert Hirschman, whom I learned this week, Tony knew in person and was a colleague of Tony, end the book that he enjoyed writing the most, The Passions and the Interests, with the following line. He says, "This is probably all one can ask of history, and of the history of ideas in particular, not to resolve issues, but to raise the level of debate." Professor Hopkins, we thank you for traveling to Stellenbosch and for presenting this third annual LEAP lecture. I hope that you, just as your 1973 book inspired a generation of scholars to work on Africa and studies Africa's economic past, so your lecture tonight will also inspire a new generation here in Africa to perhaps not resolve the issues, but to raise the level of debate. Thank you very much.